Thank you all for being here this evening. My name is Michael Konsick, Associate Director for the Institute for Public Knowledge, IPK for short. We're very happy to have Jonathan Tarleton, who's seated in the middle, author of Homes for Living, Fight for Social Housing and a New Urban Omnibus. Purchase your copy from our friends at Books on Call just outside. Please make sure to do that. Let me briefly introduce our panel, and then I'll throw it over to Josh right here. And they'll have a conversation for about 40 or 50 minutes. There'll be plenty of time for Q&A, so please get ready for questions. Jonathan Tarleton, in addition to being the author of this new book, is a writer, urban planner, and rural historian. He previously served as the chief researcher on Nonstop Metropolis and a New York City Atlas, and as the editor-in-chief of the online magazine Urban Omnibus. His essays have appeared in Orion, Jacobin, Hellgate, Third, listed publications. Sophie Gonick is an urbanist and associate professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis, just downstairs here at NYU. In her first book, Dispossession and Dissent, Immigrants and the Struggle for Housing in Madrid, explores the role of housing markets and their failures in shaping immigrant urban life and its modes of inclusion and contestation. She works extensively with grassroots collectives in Spain and the United States, including the platform People Affected by Mortgages in Cooperation with Jackson, Mississippi. Her new research examines rising housing unaffordability and immigration against histories of disinvestment and discrimination in urban United States. And last but not least, Joshua Jelly-Schapiro, just to my left, is a geographer and writer. His books include Names of New York, Island People, the Caribbean, and the World, and with Rebecca Solnit, Nonstop Metropolis, and New York City Atlas. His work appears regularly in the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, and New York Times, among many other publications. Jelly-Schapiro teaches upstairs at the Arthur Carter Journalism Institute at NYU, and has since 2022 directed the popular author talk series and Pioneering Books out in North. So thank you, Josh. I also want to thank Josh for bringing us this book talk idea to IPK, and I'll throw it over to the rest of you.
Thank you, Michael. Can you guys hear me? Is that right? Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for having us. Thank you all for being here. It's a delight to have Jonathan here to celebrate and talk about this remarkable book, Homes for Living. I want to begin actually by telling two very brief stories about this young man. And it's a particular pleasure to be here at IPK because, as you just heard in the introduction, we worked together on a project, this Atlas, Nonstop Metropolis, this collection of maps and essays about New York City, of New York City. And Jonathan was our remarkable researcher on that project. But the two quick stories I want to tell to tee up this project. One is about 12 years ago, I think, probably 2014, something like that. In this building, actually, around the time when you began to work on this book, it sounds like, when you read it initially. Rebecca Solnit forwarded me this email from a guy called Jonathan. She said, this guy seems really, really energized and interested to help out with this crazy project we've got in Nonstop Metropolis. And we should meet him. And we did so, and it was the best decision I made for the book. Jonathan did extraordinary research on any number of maps and essays in that book, amazing. Just by way of example, in the Bronx, we were trying to figure out how to map fires and housing units lost in the 1970s. And Jonathan came up with this extraordinary solution of essentially just mapping housing units lost between 1970 and 1980. And we did this to sort of map both the destruction of the borough at that time, but also the efflorescence of the culture, in particular hip-hop culture at that time. So this is one of many maps and projects that Jonathan is invaluable to, including a remarkable lesson about Moses and Jane Jacobs and Homestead and other things. Fast forward 12 years to just this past fall, or this past summer. I was at a dinner with a bunch of sort of publishing types, and I knew he'd written this book. In fact, I'd seen drafts along the way. I was hugely excited by it, absorbed it. But I had the pleasure, and it was this great moment, this writer for The New Yorker, Jennifer Wilson, who's a really talented, wonderful critic. She said, I just read this book, and I'm reviewing it for the magazine. I'm so excited by it. It's this incredible book about Mitchell-Lama houses in New York. And this guy, he's pulled together oral history and storytelling, and he's sort of written this book that resonates so deeply with my own search for housing in the city and with this moment. And it was this pleasure. I got to text Jonathan, like I got home and I said, there's going to be a big review of your book in New York, and I'm so excited. It was a wonderful sort of treat to see the ways in which this book that I had already read and admired deeply was sort of gone to resonate in the world and have the wonderful life that it's had in recent months already since it's come out. And I remember we initially started talking about this book this book and this event as a kind of launch when the book was coming out. I think Jonathan suffered a soccer injury, so we couldn't do it. But we're here now, so really just to have you here to talk about this book. Thank you for it. I have a million things I want to ask you, and I'm also so pleased to have Sophie here to help us sort of parse the implications of this book and the various subjects it touches upon. Great to be up here with two people who know much more about urban housing and urban policy than I do. But I wonder if we could just begin essentially by way of asking you to just talk about this project and how it came to be. This book, of course, it's a book about two particular housing cooperatives in the city, one here in Lower Manhattan, one in Brooklyn. And you write in remarkable sort of granular detail in this book about two sort of conversations or battles that occurred in this Southbridge and St. James around privatizing decommodified housing. And as you put it here, as the debates around privatization among the neighbors intensified, their homes became a battleground over what we owe one another, what ownership is, and how to balance competing private and collective interests within a society that venerates individual wealth, which I think is one great way to encapsulate what he then went on to do in this book. And I wonder if we could just begin by you telling us how this project came about and what it was like for the years you spent on it.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. It is wonderful to be back here and to be with you all, and thanks for your interest in being here. So this project started, as Josh said, around that time we were working on Nonstop Metropolis. I was working at a publication called Urban Omnibus, focuses on the ways in which we make the city, all the different actors that do so. Definitely check it out. It's a great publication. When we got an email from a resident of Southbridge Towers, which is a large affordable housing cooperative in Lower Manhattan, when I say cooperative, New Yorkers get it, and other cities have to be like, no, we're not talking, 3 to 6 people sharing an apartment. We are talking about 1,400 apartments where over 4,000 people live there. A resident of one of these co-ops emailed us and said, hey, there's this privatization debate happening in my building, and I'm very concerned about the future of our community. And if Josh's story about me is if you should take away anything from that, a cold email, there's no harm lost in any cold email. It could set your life on a different trajectory, like mine did, emailing Josh and Rebecca. But his, I worked with this resident on a piece about his home and these privatization debates that were taking place, and that was really one of my initial introductions to Lama housing, and that set the course of, first it was editing an article. Years later, it was doing field work, trying to take essentially somewhat of a case study approach to looking at two co-ops in the city, very similar conditions, very significant differences between these places, but grappling with the same questions and going different directions at the end of the day, and trying to tease out, why was this taking place? Why were people making the decisions they were making? And on its face, one of the reasons I stayed with these stories, or they became increasingly interesting to me, is on its face you would look at these stories and think that these discussions around privatization would be all about profit. So, in Mitchell-Lama co-ops, this is an extremely successful form of middle-income housing in New York City and New York State. Most of these, were built between 1955 and 1970. They are kept affordable. The co-ops are kept affordable by restricting the resale value of the share of the apartment, essentially. So you buy in at a very low rate. You could buy in today and some Mitchell-Lama co-ops in the city for $45,000. That's not a down payment. That's the cost. But the deal is that you buy in, and then when you want to leave, when you sell back to the co-op, you essentially get what you put in plus very limited appreciation, essentially adjusted for inflation. So the profit motive of housing, the idea that this neighborhood is on the up, and my property is going to dramatically increase in value, that doesn't happen in Mitchell-Lama housing. That the central ways in which we think about home ownership in the U.S., this is not that. This is a different way of thinking about home. The privatization debates, privatization is essentially a bit of a misnomer. I should be clear, these are private developments. They are wholly owned by the residents of the co-ops. They receive significant public subsidy, both in their creation and in maintaining their affordability, but the decision is up to the owners. If you remove the resale restriction, you can imagine, you could buy an apartment in Lower Manhattan for $45,000 today, remove the resale restriction, you could sell it for $1 million more. So the profit motive of pursuing privatization is significant. That being said, as you dig into these stories, and as I met with residents, it became abundantly clear that these debates were about significantly more than money. They were about, as the little bit of the book Josh quoted, they were about what ownership of housing actually means, what it entails, what it entitles us to, what it makes us responsible for, and how we make those decisions with the people we live with. These places that have essentially mini governments, they're massive operations with, a place that has 1,400 apartments. You can imagine there are millions and millions of dollars in just, property management and, trash removal and what have you going on at these places all the time as people are trying to figure out how to live together. And these debates place a very, they sort of distill everything about a particular community onto one very specific question, which is, what should this housing be for ourselves going forward, and what it should be for a future generation or our neighbors who are looking for affordable housing in the city. So I'll stop there.
That's a good tableau of what this book does. And I think one of the things, too, that this book does, beyond the sort of reporting that you do on these particular fights and debates within these communities, right, is that you're asking these critical questions about our approach to housing in general, about the ways in which housing interrelates with, defines our sense of ourselves as citizens, sort of rights, merits, and ourselves. And there is this particularity, and it'll be interesting to hear from Sophie shortly about sort of comparing what this looks like in other places in Spain, Denmark, and elsewhere. But it is, in certain ways, a uniquely, or at least an intensely American thing. The ways in which our housing is thought of as it's not just an asset, it's sort of the crucial asset. Yeah. Like if you haven't managed to buy property, it is appreciated, why not get to retire, for example? And this is something an idea that people are thinking of. And one of the things that you get into here, I want to talk about methods, sort of storytelling, and so on. But you talk quite a bit in here about certain people who are in favor of privatizing this thing. Essentially, you're talking about the right to profit. It's like, no, I want that. And I don't necessarily care about who might be able to enjoy this house in the future, or how maintenance costs may skyrocket, how good might be. But anyways, if you can speak a little.
Yeah, it So when I started to interview residents of both Southbridge, which again is in Lower Manhattan, and St. James Towers, which is in Clinton Hill, one of the things I started to encounter was, among the pro-privatization factions in both of these places was their conception of what ownership entailed. And in a particularly fascinating way, there was an assumption that ownership equaled profit. We know in the US that is not the case. We have plenty of crises that bear that out, whether it's 2008. That may be the case in New York City now. It certainly wasn't in the era in which Piccolano was conceived. Housing environment in New York City and the value of real estate was significantly different in the post-war period up until the 1970s. But this is something that's built into the American mindset around housing. It's that home ownership is both the method to wealth building. That is a narrative that we get sold continuously. Is the way to build wealth in the U.S. is to own property and crucially for that property to appreciate in value. Obviously, that doesn't happen everywhere. As Josh mentioned, there's also this element of the idea that housing needs to be instrumentalized for all of these other life needs, and this is very tied up with the decimation of our social safety nets and the rules in which how home ownership is there to prop up things. So there were folks within these developments who would say, "Oh, this isn't true home ownership if I cannot profit from it," which means that I'm not really a homeowner because this is limited equity housing. This is really tied up with ideas of citizenship, and one cannot talk about housing in the U.S. without talking about race. So St. James, a predominantly black cooperative, there were both residents there who were making a very strong and in some cases on its face somewhat reasonable argument that, well, I have been told that to be a full citizen in the U.S. Is to own property. I conceive of ownership as being able to profit from property. I cannot do that right now, so to be fully enfranchised, we need to privatize this place. There were other residents of the same development who said, well, we are actually this model protects us from a racist real estate system. It insulates us in a way that we have not been able to be enfranchised otherwise without this insulation. So there are sort of endless versions of these narratives within the development that are competing, that are essentially different ideas of what homes are for. The title is not really tongue-in-cheek, but it seems a somewhat obvious statement to make that homes are a place for living rather than for profit modification. But there are also strong, real concerns among residents who have reached, these places are very strong communities. There are in many cases 3 generations of families living in one co-op. And you have family members who are nearing the end of their lives, and they do not have a mechanism, those families do not necessarily have a mechanism to pay for elder care. Many other Americans may look to borrow against the value of their home in order to pay for that. That cannot be done here. So there are plenty of people making very strong arguments that I can sympathize with. That says we want to privatize because I want to take care of my mom. But that is in part a function of how the larger system has been set up, not necessarily a fault of the model, because the model in and of itself does have actual mechanisms for wealth building, just very different from how our housing system typically works.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that you also do in this book, in terms of thinking about the title and this phrase that guides it, of Homes for Living, is you develop an argument about the public good. As you say quite eloquently here, the idea or the conception of public good tied up in these kinds of cooperative housing developments is that whether or not you are sort of the owner of the bodies of these homes, that they are public good that matters to us all. the city. And I wonder, yeah, just by bringing thinking about public good, thinking about housing. And also, to sort of pivot slightly, one thing that Jonathan does in this book, right, is utilize the sort of methods of oral history. So you're talking with these characters, and we'll talk about the characters that populate this book as a way to tell the story. Sophie, you've done similar work in different contexts, utilizing ethnographic methods. Right? But I wonder if you could just speak a little to, essentially the ways in which sort of Jonathan's project here resonates with and differs from what you found in sort of investigating the roles of housing in public good, public conceived, public understandings, whatever you want to riff on. Small talk.
Yeah, lots here to talk about. So, first of all, I would actually push back on in many ways, yes, there is a very strong kind of American tradition of homeownership, but there's also that model of homeownership shows up in a lot of other places. I wrote a book about the Spanish case, and what's interesting actually about the Spanish case in comparison with the American case is that our kind of contemporary homeownership model in the United States emerges during the Depression and is really seen as an effort also to kind of quell the rabble and to prevent rabble rousing. It's turning, potential rabble, working class people into nice little capitalists through the vehicle of the home. In Spain, it actually is occurring under Franco in a very different political system, an autarkic, authoritarian system, but it's also seen as a tool to quell the rabble and to turn, potential communists into, they quite literally talk about turning proletariats into property owners. And a lot of the ideologies are very similar, of creating kind of fully self-actualized individuals, of creating harmonious society through the vehicle of homeownership that, is kind of like, if I own my home and Jonathan owns his home and Josh owns his, we all respect one another's private property rights, we'll live in harmony. And this harkens back, also to kind of Jeffersonian ideals, to John Locke, who you bring up. But there's within that a paradox, because in fact what you're creating are people who are self-interested, and often that self-interest is around property values. But of course, property values only really work because some people are excluded. That this is, that it's not a model that can be kind of extended to everybody. It relies on particular exclusions, and here's where we kind of can get into the questions of, race and gender and a number of, different, the ways in which non-normative individuals are often, made even more vulnerable by some of these systems. But I want to also pick up on this kind of, this idea that yes, property values always rise, and that's not the case. I wrote about people going through eviction and foreclosure in Spain. But one of the things that I think is really interesting in this book, and that you've kind of hinted at, is the way in which markets are also very socially produced, and that kind of mania of getting in on something, or else it's gonna pass you by. Because I think, and this is where like historical specificity is really key. Because I think like what you illustrate with the residents of Southbridge here in downtown Manhattan is they're watching this kind of urban transformation happening all around them. They're watching gentrification unfold and want to get in on the pie. Whereas the residents, or a lot of the residents in St. James, because of their experiences as African Americans in the real estate market, as witnessing the constant kinds of exclusions and vulnerabilities to which they've been exposed, and the ways in which the real estate market can kind of chew them up and spit them out, and even banish them from the city, see that gentrification happening and think, wait, no, this is the way that we hold on, right? And so thinking also about the ways in which, these kinds of social production of value of markets, how they're particular to historical moments, and also how they, how different kind of, I guess, constituents respond to that kind of mass market hysteria, I think is really what's one of the things that's very interesting about this book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one place to go with that is the sort of question of methods and storytelling, actually, is that as you say some of the ways in which perception of markets are experiencing socially used and experienced. As we mentioned earlier, one of the distinctive things about this book, and you say it right from the outset, is that you trained as an oral historian and so are invested in these records. And as you put it early in the book, you say, I wanted to talk to all these people about their experience and what their sense of these battles were. As you put it, if I'm getting this right, how they said it or the stories they told is as important as what they're saying. This is very much something else, right? And part of what makes this book a delight to read is these characters, these people who are telling their stories in very particular important ways. But I wonder if you could just talk a little about, the methods that go into this and their sense of story, people's stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my intent to kind of use my background in oral history as a method in this book was it's both research method, but it's also a storytelling method in many ways. One of the ways in which I think think of this book as this grandiose an intervention in the conversation around housing is that much of our conversation about housing in New York and in the U.S. is about numbers of some variety, whether they're units or affordability levels or rents. These are counts or dollar values, and people get left by the wayside. So foregrounding the stories of the actual residents who are engaged in these debates is in part something that I'm very attached to, something that how I wanted to approach the book. And the kind of approach using oral history, or you can call it deep interviewing over long periods of time. These are folks who I, in some cases, met as early as 2016. Did additional rounds of interviewing with them in 2018, 2020, right before the pandemic, and to this day, kind of follow up to see both how they're, I should back up and say one of the unique aspects of these fights is that they are not quick. These privatization debates take place over, in some cases, a decade, sometimes more, in part because of some of the regulatory aspects of how these votes have to take place. There are 3 different votes. There are very complex legal documents. And so there's a lot of things for folks to respond to. So I was also interested in, for lack of a better term, buyer's remorse. It's like someone voted one way, one year, and then, the thing that their opponent said would happen 3 years down the line does in fact come to pass. And how do they think about their decisions differently? So I would say that I think that, what you were saying about how they say something is really indicative of these deeper narratives around housing, how they characterize why they're making a decision, the things they point out as a corollary. I'm thinking of one resident at St. James who was staunchly pro-privatization. One could say he's a conspiracy theorist. He was also has some great points. He would say things like. One of the ways in which these buildings are continually supported by the public sector is through property tax abatements, and which actually recently just got sweeter, 2 days ago, from the Hochul administration. They just decreased the amount of tax that these kinds of developments have to pay, but you lose that when you privatize. So this is part of the debate about, is this actually good for us, is it not? But he would say something like, well, you say we're going to lose our property tax exemption if we remove remove the affordability on our building. And then he would, point down the street and say, but what about the Barclay Center? What about what is now called Pacific Park, which, has oodles and oodles of tax abatements with, in some case, not a whole lot to show for it on the affordability side. And so the way, even if I have a deep disagreement with his idea that we should privatize this, I should be able to profit from this home, he's also drawing out all of these inconsistencies in our public policy, all the ways in which we are holding residents of these developments up to a higher standard than we hold giant corporations, and frankly saddling them with a terrible decision. I mean, this is one of the things that I came to think about in having these conversations with folks, is that I would never in my life want to have to make this decision. And I think coming into the project, I initially thought, well, this is a clear, to me this is clear. This is not a good outcome. And we should try to prevent people from privatizing what is something that we as the public have invested in to have our city be affordable for many people. Using kind of an oral history approach and interviewing people over time, you do come to see the burden of such a decision, the ways in which people have to make this calculation of, well, not just should I profit or should I not, but if we vote to privatize, will I actually get priced out of this housing in X number of years? Do I want to stay in the city? What is the best decision for my family versus a larger we? I mean, one of the interesting things here is that this was built not just for its current residents, but for future beneficiaries. But those future beneficiaries are not at the table in this decision-making process. And yet, we expect people who, have a lot going on otherwise. They all have jobs there, caretaking for people, to, in some cases, wade through a 600-page offering document that is supposed to project the future of their co-op and on which they're supposed to make a decision. So I think the oral history approach just allows you to see the massive gray areas in this, to certainly have a better sense of why people who are, in many cases, the primary beneficiaries of this public investment, of what is a shining example of social housing that we have. Why would the primary beneficiaries of that essentially, some of them, try to demolish it? And that is a pressing thing that we have to contend with if we, A, want to preserve this kind of housing, if we want to build more and have it last for an enduring period of time. We have to really grapple with that. And I think getting into people's stories is the way to understand both the cultural narratives, the financial imperatives, the social environments that create a bit of a fervor around doing this. And I don't think I would have actually gotten that otherwise. I may have stayed very surface level. And if you look at many news articles about this, it's like, ooh, these Brooklyn cooperators are about to hit it big. That it's like just Google eyes real estate dollars. But there's so much going on underneath it. And if we don't grapple with what's going on underneath it, then we won't actually be able to preserve these places at all.
Yeah, I think one of the things I really appreciate about this book, that is also, I think, in some ways in conversation with my book, is it's what you can do with, in my case, I'm an ethnographer. I still am not entirely sure what the difference, where the line between ethnography and oral history lies. I know we have some anthropologists in the room, maybe they can enlighten me later. This kinds of extended interaction with a place, with the people who populate it and give it life, allows you to interrogate things like this overarching ideology of ownership and home ownership within the American context or the Spanish context, with the way it's lived in the everyday, right? That it reveals all of these kinds of silences and conflicts, right? That ownership is promising one thing, and I love this idea of this is not real ownership, and I'm not allowed to do whatever I want with my house, But as somebody who actually does own a house in New York, it's not like, honey, can we, my husband's over there, he's a contractor. Honey, can we build like a few extra stories on top of our house?
No, we can't.
Right? Unfortunately. Yeah, we can't just knock it down and put up, a high rise. And we have to pay property taxes. When things go wrong, we have to, hire a mason to point the bricks, that there are all of these, that there's all this labor that goes into it, which also is, historically what's also kind of fed into ideas around the right to property, that we're now at a point where that's kind of extenuated, right? We just, if you live in a non-limited equity co-op in New York, you pay a maintenance fee, you get to have a super who comes and does that for you, but often it's a lot of money, right? It's not just this one-time big purchase that then accrues value over the course of its life, but instead something that you kind of actively have to maintain and worry about. And but that this kind of extended interaction allows us to really unpack these kinds of categories that seem so kind of obvious and stolid in a particular way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing I think about when I think about sort of historical specificity, they're both sort of gesturing toward it, and the differences in the stories that you tease out there in Southbridge and St. James, that there are racialized differences in the relationship of cooperators in both these places to property ownership. And in particular, you invoke the work of candidate Martha Taylor, and her phrase for predatory inclusion, ways in which African Americans, for so long, have been excluded from certain kinds of ownership and property regimes, were incorporated into certain of those systems in a way that was predatory and harmful, right? But I wanted to get toward, and I think there's so much going on in the city right now and around these conversations. Mayoral race, that's right. Heating up, soon to be concluded. We also have changes in policy around marijuana. Right? That there's reforms that went in a couple of years ago that have to do with making it more difficult to practice. And I was amazed in reading this book. I hadn't known the history, and my mother-in-law was in town. She got fortunate in that way. But I hadn't realized just how big the system was when I went in. 140,000 apartments in the city, 270 buildings. Now it sounds like 10,000 or something. But I wonder if you could just talk to us a little, Jonathan. I'd love to then hear from Sophie about this, who's looking at different sort of sectors of the housing situation in the city now. But what can you tell us about sort of this story since it's concluded in the book? These reforms have gone in. Southbridge, not to scroll over, Southbridge, voted to privatize St. James. Yeah, there you go. But 1.5 million, right, to buy into Southbridge. In any case, there's anxiety there about, if we go private, this is going to skyrocket. I'd be curious to hear if that's indeed happening, and sort of what this story looks like now, given new policy.
Yeah. So a lot has happened. So just some background. The residents of these co-ops, many of them, when they are voting to privatize, they kind of fall into two camps. You make out like a bandit if you want to leave. So there are folks who, you vote to privatize, you get your house on the market, you're able to, sell. When you sell, the co-op collects what's called a flip tax, and this is substantial. It can be up to 30% of the sale price. And the reason that is in place is it essentially to subsidize the folks that are staying. So, as I mentioned before, these developments get all kinds of property tax abatements. They get access to really cheap financing from the city and state. That is the primary, carrot for staying in the development, or in the program rather. And once you privatize, that goes away. So costs skyrocket. Your property tax bill goes up. You have to, when you need to do physical maintenance on the building, which these buildings are over 50 years old at this point. That's significant. You got to replace the roof. You got to repoint the bricks. You got to replace the boiler. You have to borrow at market rates. You're no longer getting what is essentially very cheap financing from the state. The flip tax, that 30% on the resale value, applies to the first sale on all of these apartments. So that goes back to the co-op, and it is intended to offset that increase in cost. But that will run out at some point. So you're essentially looking, this is debate internally, which is that if you want to stay, and if you want to stay for a long time, your costs are going to go up. There are people in these developments who may in fact own their home as a cooperator and own a very, quote unquote valuable home if these places privatize, but they may not be able to afford their own maintenance. So they may have to leave against their will, essentially. So what that also means is Southbridge. Let's come back to Southbridge. Southbridge votes to privatize after essentially a decade-long fight. Everything seems to be going swimmingly, as projections would show. First few years of this, no big deal. That flip tax revenue, people are selling. That means there's money coming into the co-op to offset the costs. People aren't having to pay more for their homes that they already own. And then the pandemic hits. Sales in the city crash. People don't want to buy into a 1,400 unit cooperative. And without that money coming in, there's nothing to offset those increased costs. So all of a sudden, there are people there who said, oh, I thought we would be fine for at least 15 years, who within 4 or 5 years of privatizing are all of a sudden saying, oh, well, our cooperative is no longer so financially sound. And in fact, in order to fill the gap, we're going to have to raise costs on ourselves. So that happens, things kind of even out after the pandemic, but there's also significant social changes in these developments, which I think are really interesting. These debates tear places apart. In the same way that they're very tight-knit, these debates would split families down the middle. There are death threats, there are flyers all over. There are essentially little newspapers inside the developments that are really there to smear your neighbor or argue for your point. And the dynamics change when new folks start buying in, and they start buying in for millions of dollars versus someone who maybe bought their apartment essentially for $3,000 in 1970. And they want different things. So you also have this difference in culture, essentially, where, now there's a fight at the board level, co-op board level, storied in New York. They are very tense in this, which is where a lot of this tension plays out. They want to invest in a really fancy lobby. They want to invest in a doormat. They want to invest in this. And the folks who have been living there are like, well, we don't want to pay more for that. We've been living here just fine. We love our homes. But there are folks with, frankly, a lot more money moving in who want a different kind of place. You mentioned the kind of neighborhood environment that goes into these debates as well. And I think one of the, we mentioned how racialized some of these debates are. A strain of argument at Southbridge was keeping up with the Joneses, which was essentially the neighborhood around us is gentrifying, and now we feel they felt like the poor ones, to put it bluntly, except for the New York City Housing Authority developments right down the street, but they did not want to be seen as public housing. So their way of distancing themselves from both a poorer and, frankly, blacker or browner populace was to privatize. that dynamic changes when they do privatize, because now there is this economic distinction among the residents themselves, and essentially a new argument internally that mirrors what they were sort of trying to distance themselves from otherwise. So it continues to this day to be sort of fascinating how this plays out over time. St. James is sitting great. They very interestingly voted not to privatize, but their board was still primarily pro-privatization. So another aspect of these debates is you have to wait a year in which to start this process over again, but the book is never really closed. A pro-privatization contingent within a building or within a co-op can always do this again. And this has in fact happened at Southbridge. This was not the first privatization debate in that building. And so there was this fear that like, oh, they're just gonna come again. But as Josh mentioned, in part because of organizing on a citywide level, there's a wonderful organization called Cooperators United for Digital Llama that plays a massive role in supporting pro-Mitchell Llama cooperators at different developments. They also advocate on a city and state level for changes in policy. And you know, now the board president at St. James was at one point the only pro-Mitchell Llama member of that board. He is very active in that organization, helped win new regulations at the state level to increase the voting threshold. So it used to be you have to get, you know, a two-thirds majority in order to privatize. That got bumped up to 80%, making it almost impossible at certain developments for this to take place. That being said, there are new kind of frontiers of this fight all the time. There are different policies. There's now a possibility to transition your Llama to it's called an HDFC, another form of a cooperative. Some advocates see that as a form of kind of privatization light, essentially a path towards future privatization. So that's now happening. The first one of those happened in Brooklyn Heights earlier this year, and there are folks that are very concerned about that. But I'll say the last thing I'll say is that I mentioned this before. What is called the shelter rent, or the property tax that Vigilantes pay, was just dropped further by the Hochul administration. Meaning, that's another way of sweetening the deal, essentially, to stay in the program and to preserve this housing, and removing essentially that profit program. Such a large
So I want to go back to the mention of predatory inclusion, which is something that Keeanga Taylor coins in relation to the extension of homeownership to low-income Black people, I think largely in the 70s, that they're included, but on these very predatory terms. Before the event, we were chatting, and I was talking about my new work, which I've been interviewing newly arrived immigrants on their experiences finding housing outside of the shelter system here in New York, which, as you can imagine, is very bleak. But one of the things that people tell me, I've largely been talking to Ecuadorians, is just how here you live for the rent. The rent, having to pay the rent, is just this kind of overwhelming, ethos that kind of drives your daily life. And then they contrast this very much to kind of their previous experiences, in this case back in Ecuador. So I was talking about that, one of the things that I've been thinking about is precisely riffing on this predatory inclusion idea that actually, being included into these markets in a number of different ways also encourages people to be predatory themselves. You have to kind of be self-interested in order to survive. Particularly if you're, kind of newly arrived and at the bottom of the proverbial urban food chain. And so, in a lot of ways, it makes sense to, and because real estate is a site in which you can make audacious amounts of money, trying to get in, and also of needing to also just find a way to live one's life, organizes so much of the city, you know. And I know we all live somewhere. We all probably, I think we have some high school students, so you're probably not so worried about housing costs. But just wait a little bit. But probably everybody else at one point or another has had to worry. And so, you know, we don't get to live in the neighborhood we want to live in. We have to leave the city. We have to, you know, move to a neighborhood farther out, etc. Because, you know, of just the rapaciousness of New York City real estate. And so, you know, if there's a way to get in on it, it also kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, there are many reams of stories to be told about that happening in the Mitchell-Lama context. I mean, it is a site of corruption precisely for this reason. You know, you can think about, what is one of the most scarce things in New York City? It's an affordable place to live. And so, what happens around scarce things? Well, corruption and growth. So there are certainly stories. When Josh read an early version of this book, there was a story in Coney Island of folks. Yeah, you also read that. There were three people who were on the board of a co-op in Coney Island who were essentially selling spots on the wait list for it. So there are wait lists that determine who is next in line when an apartment opens up to buy into the co-op. And these wait lists are they are overseen by city and state government, but they are administered by the cooperatives themselves. And you know, people would essentially be paying what is actually a remarkable little amount for New York City real estate, but significantly more than they would actually have to pay to buy into these co-ops to jump spots. And this happened. There was a version of this at Southbridge itself with a resident and someone at the state regulatory agency essentially illegally subletting, you know, a parent's apartment. And so this happens around these environments. And that's not to say that there is actually anything wrong with the model. It's actually an indication of just how desperate the situation is and how, you know, there's opportunism when these are such scarce resources.
I want to open this to questions in just a moment, but I'll, just by way of one last prompt for you both, and just to return us to the kind of current moment, kind of political context. I think one thing that somebody was just speaking to, the ways in which rent or just housing costs, right, are just such a massive part of our lives that we live in this city. And housing costs just rise and rise in the last few years. People thought, COVID, and one thing I appreciated about this New Yorker review, the book that I mentioned, in Wilson's piece, she talks about the kind of epiphany of learning about Mitchell, of being like, wait, there's something, we all know this sort of dilemma, like, if you live in New York City, if you don't work on Wall Street, kind of what are you supposed to do? Right, if you don't qualify for public housing, you live on Wall Street, can you buy, can you rent, both of you can buy a house. Right now, Ray, we have a candidate from there who famously and notably has sort of built his campaign around affordability and housing. And I wonder, just a question for both of you before we go to the crowd out here. What lessons from this book, and perhaps could Mr. Mondani take? But I'd also just be curious to hear from both of you, and Sophie as well, just sort of what the picture looks like, housing-wise, for perhaps a new American.
Thank you. So what, you know, famously, candidate Mondani's tagline is "Freeze the Rent." There's another aspect to his platform, which is to build a lot of social housing. What we have in Mitchell-Lama is arguably the best example of a social housing model in the U.S. There are many other forms of this that, you know, go through various periods of vogue. Like community land trusts are very in the public conversation. We have public housing, which is, you know, our biggest form of social housing that has been defunded over years and years and years and years, and can continue to be a very important model and source of social housing and affordable housing for us, and has to be if we're really going to bring rents down. One thing that I wanted to get across in this book, both for the New York context, but also the American context broadly, is that we can do this. This is not just a European thing. We have done this. We have a very successful model of it. And we also need to be very cognizant when we are launching new programs around social housing of how to maintain. Because we are launching them in an environment that is incredibly hostile to them. There is a kind of constant attempt to erode, or not even attempt, just the larger environment is eroding the idea that housing can be more than a commodity, or that housing shouldn't first be primarily a commodity and then a place to live. And something that I thought a lot about in this book was, we think a lot about maintenance. Well, we probably don't think enough about maintenance, but we, in housing, Sophie was talking about repointing bricks. Like, we talk a lot about physical maintenance. It's very important. And, that's often the conversation with, say, NYCHA developments, is that the physical maintenance really isn't there. They can become difficult places to live, in part because they have not been funded to maintain. We talk about financial maintenance. You hear people talking about, refinancing their mortgages all the time, or finding a good rate, or figuring, how do we bring in money to do the physical maintenance. I think there is a somewhat appreciated version of this, particularly in social housing, that I think of a sense of social maintenance. So what are the actual reasons that we build this? And that is sort of what dissipates in some of these Mitchell-Lama developments over time. When these were built, when places like Cooper Village, or Skytown, or Penn South, or any manner of formerly or still currently decommodified housing was built, there was often an ethos there. There was a public purpose that was stated. There was, in some cases, a strong intent from the developer. So you have plenty of labor-built housing in New York City. Interestingly enough, these two developments were built by Tishman Speyer. They were not, being motivated to, support the working class. They were motivated by a very good development deal. But over time, the kind of public purposes of these places can fade away. The reason they exist can be reduced, especially when our public policy is focused primarily on those first two things. So something I thought about a lot in this book is that, our primary mechanism for maintaining housing that is currently affordable and keeping it so is to offer cheap debt, to put some, and to do so by when we do that, to put some sort of restriction on it. To say this is going to be affordable for another 15 years. Personally, I think that unfortunately plays into a somewhat financialized sense of housing. It's like, when the residents of these developments are weighing, should we take more debt and stay in the program, they're saying, is this a good deal? We're not necessarily, and I should say, I think this funding is very good. We should keep providing it. But that being said, we also have to be carrying with it a narrative around why we are investing in this housing. And we also know that laws change. So, for example, Mitchell-Lama, initially, privatization was not possible. It was not in the original legislation. It was actually a change to the program. So there are both co-op Mitchell-Lamas and there are original Mitchell-Lamas. There was a change to the law that started this whole program to try to incentivize more rental construction. And that was to allow a developer who has built the building to 15, 20 years after doing that, they paid off their city or state mortgage, they could take those units to market rates. That would in fact incentivize more rental development. That is not the case for co-ops. But that same provision was applied to co-ops. So we know that even if we are building more social housing now, down the line the rules of the game can be changed. And the only way in which to really preserve social housing in the long term is to build a narrative around why they exist, to build political will and political power around maintaining it as such. And that's the way to preserve it. There's someone in the latter part of the book, which we kind of go beyond New York City, a tenant organizer out of Kansas City who's, as people love to do, pointing at a Vienna model. But what she says is, housing, privatization of this nature there is such a third rail that no one would even consider touching it. It would be political suicide. And so that is the sort of kind of political and narrative structure that we need to build around this housing in order to really carry it. So a hint for, in thinking about new social housing now, that has to be part
Oh man, this is like such a big question, but I would also say I'm so sick of we have pointing to the Vienna model. Like, come on, there must be some other model. And in fact, I mean, and so
break down the Vienna model.
Oh no, I'm not. It's public housing, and there's no income restriction essentially. And I think we also we don't really pay attention to the Singapore model, which is also essentially public housing that has a kind of quasi looks like homeownership, also no income restriction. The vast majority of Singaporeans live in this kind of state-sponsored housing, and guess what? They have capitalism run amok there. It's that you can have a kind of strong social housing model alongside really great market capitalism. I don't necessarily want to give our friend Zohran, I don't know what my recommendations would be to Zohran, but I think also empowering the groups that are already on the ground. So we haven't even really mentioned the last section of this book where Jonathan talks to, he explores some of kind of indigenous practices of land stewardship. He talks about community land trusts. We're members of community land trusts in East New York, where we live. It's hard though, it's involves organizing, it involves cooperation, which we see, a lot of, and also how that goes wrong. Tenants unions, and for example, that I think, unfortunately, it's really incumbent upon us to talk to our neighbors and get organized, because even, my husband, for example, before we moved in together, we had a situation where he was in a rent-stabilized apartment, and then the building sold, and the landlord just said, "Oh no, this is not rent-stabilized," and it was completely legally murky, and who knows, eventually, in the end. But then there are all these tricks that they use, and so really, what's the recourse? It's organizing. It's getting together with your neighbors and confronting the powers that be. Of course, that also takes a lot of time and energy, and it's not an easy, quick, immediate fix. And so, that what I would say to Zohran is to see what's working out there, see what's working at the grassroots level. I mean, and he was comes out of foreclosure prevention activism, and so he knows what's up.
Questions? Oh, he's got it.
I was just wondering, when you're talking with people that have different opinions on it, especially for privatization, how did you draw out those opinions, and how did you balance your own opinions with also trying to properly represent how they feel?
Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, one interesting aspect of interviewing folks who are pro-privatization is many of them immediately were suspect of me, not because they thought I maybe had a different idea from them, but because they thought I worked for the city or state. They thought I was part of HPD. Yeah, and so, I mean, I think inherently, if you're doing history work or ethnography work, your curiosity and interest in their perspective is and I don't mean this in any way against exploitative way, but like a disarming factor. People actually often want to talk about their experience. And if you spend the time with them to actually hear out their ideas, again, even if you may disagree with them, they're often fairly want to be forthcoming and want to explain their perspective. As I said before, I disagree with the perspective of various people in this book. But there is this overriding thing that we do share, and I do not currently live in New York, but I did for many years, which is a sense that this system is deeply broken. And even if I may disagree with, say, your decision around like privatizing, your vote to privatize Midland development, I can totally, agree. It's like, yeah, this is not working. Like this is difficult, and I can share I can share my own experiences with housing. I work as an urban planner. I've done affordable housing development. I've done housing policy work, and I've seen the ways in which affordable housing programs themselves are deeply difficult to navigate. I understand why someone, even if I disagree with it, would pursue privatization in this way, and just empathizing with people on that level. It's like, oh, you want to privatize because you don't know how you're going to pay for your mom's health care. Like, that is something that is, very relatable to most people. And so I think that is a way that, you sit with people for long enough that they may not trust you, but they will faithfully share what their experience.
Yeah, I think it's about approaching people with curiosity, of wanting to understand their perspective, exactly what you said. I mean, when I was doing interviews in Spain, I was interviewing people going through processes of foreclosure, and some of them were immigrants who bought like terrible, decrepit old apartments for hundreds of thousands of euros when they made like €1,000 a month working as a construction worker. I think, like, in my mind, like, WTF? Why was this? This is clearly predatory, but that made sense to that person in the moment. And so, what I'm interested in is like, what was that common sense that prompted that decision, right? Rather than judging them, I think it's about understanding what is the circumstances that produce this particular kind of decision making, whether it's about privatization or it's about taking out a subprime loan for a crappy apartment,
Yeah, I think another thing I would add is, these, I think about one guy in particular who he's now in his 80s. He moved to Brooklyn when he was in his 20s, and he was at that time the only black person on the block. Got into St. James from the very beginning, has lived there for many, many decades, and he writes these basically manifestos about what homeownership is, what the American dream is, why we should privatize, and he has these pages and pages that he sends out to cooperators. He served on the board of the co-op for many, many years, which is difficult work. He has in fact given so much to this community. He served on the community board. He was, a person known in Clinton Hills, Bed-Stuy. And I mean, I have deep respect for the real labor that he has put into this place. Hours and hours, and he makes an argument. One of the arguments that I think is very interesting is that people will say, well, we deserve to privatize and profit from this place because we built it. We created the value that is here. And it's actually kind of a mirror image of certain arguments that get used in anti-gentrification debates. Is that we deserve to stay here because we built this community, which is true. And it is true that Lester Goodyear in fact, was a key element in maintaining St. James as a wonderful place to live. The difference is like displacing that value. If you know, and who gets to accrue that value? We want to stay and benefit from the value we have created, the community we created, versus we want to, you know, take the money and run. But I think in these conversations, you know, it's just so clear that these people do, in fact, they have different ideas of what they want for their community, but they love these places. And so that's, you know, that's something that's like, wow, they really care about this place, and they have a particular idea of how to show that happiness.
Hi, thank you for this talk. It's very, very informative and interesting. I had just started reading the book yesterday, so I haven't gotten very far, but definitely going to keep going. This is very cool topic. But the one thing that I got far enough to hear you when you use the term infrastructure, and housing is infrastructure, and thinking of infrastructure as like a utility, electricity, water. Water is a basic life need. Roads, bridges, all these things that are heavily regulated and generally public and public goods, in that they are both a public commodity and like a public good, as in you know, this public necessity, public health need. And housing is not that. I just wanted to try to get more of your thoughts on housing as infrastructure, meaning a public good, as opposed to this kind of chaotic market commodity thing.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you with me. You know, I talk about, you know, public good has a public good has a kind of economics definition, and then it has what I think is a more kind of socially understood definition, which is like the basic things that we need as a society to function. And, you know, housing is shelter, is, you know, from time immemorial has been included among those. I think an interesting aspect of this is if we think back to the origins of sort of American home ownership, is that when it was conceived, it was not actually conceived as a wealth building initiative. It was as Sophie shared, there was a quelling of social dissent aspect to it, of, you know, if we saddle people with debt, if we have something, you know, like a home that they have, you know, they will organize, they won't organize, or what have you. But it was not intended to be what it has, you know, kind of in the American mind come to be, which is the mechanism to build wealth and whatnot, which is housing as a commodity. So that was not actually really in the frame. As far as, you know, it being infrastructure, I kind of see it as a given, frankly. It's almost an argument that I don't, you know how to have, because I'm just like, no, we need this, everyone needs this. And I think something that Josh mentioned early on, I think it is also something that we all benefit from each other now. And that is sort of the conceit behind a program like this, or a good argument of why, you know, we need affordable housing, even if we are not the ones who are benefiting from it. Is that in fact, we need people who, you know, we all know that certain jobs get paid more despite providing much less social utility, if you want to put it in those terms. And, you know, we can talk about, people love to talk about all day, like, oh, we need the teachers and the firefighters and the this and the that. But, you know, that exists across all kinds of professions, all kinds of people, and we all benefit from each of us having a safe, stable, affordable place to live, which makes it, in my mind, the idea of, you know, infrastructure and what you want from your infrastructure, what you want from your bridge. Every time you're going over a bridge, you don't want to be thinking about, is this thing going to fall apart? Like, you know, and functional infrastructure is essentially invisible. You know, like, we don't have a lot of that in the U.S., including our bridges. But when infrastructure is working well, we don't even think about it being there. We don't actually, there are many people who, like, will won't think about a water utility until the rates go up. So I'll pass this.
I mean, I've long thought that housing is infrastructure and should be considered as such, that it's, it sustains life, and yes, it's part, I mean, and I think that this question of the collections of public good that has so long been about kind of the way that we've done it in this society is very much on this kind of individualist basis of like make everybody kind of self-sufficient, but that clearly doesn't work, right? And so I agree 100%, but how do we get there is another question.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a, the central premise of, say, social housing and a lot of arguments of this book about housing can't serve its role as infrastructure if it is a commodity. Because it will always, then it's serving a different purpose. It's always being bought and sold for, whatever quote-unquote the market can bear. It will be chopped up as a financial instrument. It will serve a totally different purpose. If it's doing that, it can't serve as a safe, stable, affordable place to live. So to me, those two things are totally diametrically opposed. So until we do that, until we insulate housing from, at least the most egregious pieces of the market, then it won't continue to be able to be infrastructure or collaboration.
We have a couple questions in the back, so perhaps we can take them together.
Thank you. So you mentioned gentrification when you were talking about like the mania in the market. I was curious about how social housing as a solution can combat issues of gentrification. I come from a multi-generational home in a very gentrified neighborhood. So I was curious, would it like combat the issue of gentrification, or would it kind of work hand in hand with it?
I think over here.
My question is, with things looking so profit-driven and unequal, like what signs of like progress or resistance make you positive change? Is it still possible?
Oh, do we have one? Yeah, this may be the last question.
So it's actually more of a comment, because you were saying, how do we get to, the point where it becomes infrastructure? I think you look at our homeless population and the moral imperative and what successes we've had with the veterans population, getting that population off the street. And right now, there's a citywide initiative to stop having births happen in shelters. There are over 2,000 births that happen in our shelter system every year. And that imperative, because it's time bound, right, to birth, that might be a big difference.
Just on the last point, we also, I mentioned my current work, we did do a crazy job creating 65,000 shelter beds for migrants. It's a very variegated landscape. It's by no means perfect. It's been very, very polemical, but it shows that when there is public will, you can actually do things, right? So.
To go back to your question, it's a really good question. So, St. James, this co-op that's in Clinton Hill, the part of Clinton Hill that used to be known as Bed-Stuy. All Clinton Hill used to be known as Bed-Stuy. Yeah, sorry, that's what I mean. So residents there. One resident in particular, her name is Wenna. She's also in her 80s. Kind of crazy coincidence. Her dad was an architect on the building, and then they moved in sort of against their desires. They had tried to buy a plot of land in the Bronx, and then when the seller found out that they were black, pulled out the sale. And so they bought into this co-op. And she talks about basically watching the neighborhood gentrify around St. James, and watching other black folks like her get pushed out of the neighborhood. And she says she has a friend who they go and sit on her porch, and they count the number of black folks that walk by, and they do that year after year, and they see how that decreases. one of the reasons that she argued for maintaining social housing was, in fact, that insulation from the housing market where St. James could not be gentrified. It could have the market pressures, the same market pressures that were involved in increasing rents, deed theft, all manner of aspects of how gentrification in that community took place. They were still obviously operating on St. James in the form of these privatization events, in the form of this possible profit. That being said, the folks who lived there didn't have to worry about getting pushed out. So in that sense, I see social housing as a way of, long-term residence. It's a very stable form of long-term residency somewhere. And in fact, if your desire is to stay in a community, like there's hardly a better deal that you can find than, living in a co-op in the Mitchell-Lama. It's like, yeah, you may not make out like a bandit if you want to leave, but if you want to stay somewhere, it's stable for the most part. There are, of course, exceptions for places that aren't managed very well or have a lot of challenges. So I don't see it as, going hand in hand with gentrification in that way. I think it is in fact a bulwark against it.
Last question. Points of hope.
I would also add, I think, and in some of the proposals around social housing, it's not just like let's build a number of new towers in the parks, right? There are a lot of different ideas are being experimented with, including around maintenance. And I think, one of the things of like a multi-generational house, like in the neighborhood that we live in Cypress Hills, the big problem is not just gentrification, but it's like keeping up with the tax bills, keeping up with the brick pointing and the leaks and that serve to drive people out. And so also thinking about the kinds of low-income like homeowner grants that also help people stay. There are kind of a range of different policies that's not just let's build more Mitchell-Lama or let's build more NYCHA. There are a range of different experiments that can take place. And with that, like also to the point of like these kind of rays of hope of, some of these experiments are some of them have good and bad. As I mentioned that we're involved in our local community land trusts. There's been a lot of excitement around community land trusts here in New York, and there are a number of them that are that have been developed over the last just like 15 or so years. In Queens and Brooklyn, we're actually right across the street from a building that's owned by the Cooper Square Community Land Trust. And so there are these interesting kind of market carve-outs. But as you say, it's like from scaling them is the question.
I think there's, one of the things that was really interesting as I followed these stories over a decade, and as I followed conversations about social housing in the U.S. over that same time period, is, these models are being revisited in the U.S. in a way that they haven't been for a very, very long time. Housing affordability is obviously, I kind of hate this metric, but it used to be said that like housing on the federal level was not even really a policy issue for the longest time, and now it is in the debates. And that is, of course, a marker of how bad things are, but it is also it's pushing people to reevaluate their assumptions around what housing could be. Instead of saying, oh, well, like, definitely I'm really bought into this idea of homeownership as a way to make a bunch of money, people are actually saying, well, I just want to stay in a place to live. And I want that for my family, and I want that for my neighbor. And so there is momentum, not just in New York City, around models like this. Chicago has recently passed legislation to build social housing. Seattle has formed a new social housing developer funded by the tax levy. So this is, social housing as a term wasn't really used in the U.S. popularly like 5 years ago. And so this conversation is shifting in a direction where these are on the political table. And we have to continue, I mean, it's an ongoing thing. We have to watch any of the New York City debates around this. It's like we have to continue pushing back against certain assumptions about this isn't possible here, or this is too expensive, or we can't do this at this scale. And we have plenty of examples of where that is actually possible when, as Sophie said, the political will is there. And so I take hope from that. It's of course hope in the sense of, well, things are rough, very rough. You know, and to go back to one of the tenant organizers in the book, you know, when she says, when we go out to talk to people about social housing, she doesn't say, so are you interested in social housing? She's like, the radicalizing question is, how are you doing? It's like, how are you living these days? And people are like, not well. And then they, you know, you just have a conversation about it, and that leads to kind of switches going off where it's like, well, we can actually think of housing in a different way, and that is in itself hopeful.
This is what's all from on top.
Exactly.
You know, kind of talking idea. You got it over the front.
That's it. These are human stories. I think we could talk about this stuff.
Yeah.
I also think that, apropos what Jonathan just said about social housing becoming part of our conversation, I think it's fair to say that this book is helping make it so. And I want to, because I'm moderating, I get the privilege of, I'm not going to make him do it, I'm just going to do a few lines from the end of this book to close us out. I think back to Lester Goodyear typing away on the 21st floor of St. James, fearful of losing his chance of his American dream, and determined to finally be part of a league with the dominant scooter. He wrote, "Ownership of real property gives the owner the essential first step in becoming a person of economic substance in American society." He'd written this sentence as an indictment against anti-privatizers, but there's another way to read it. For me, it serves even better as an assessment of the illness that such a conception of ownership breeds among us. Goodyear may not know that he, too, is pointing us toward a renewed vision of ownership and stewardship, and is teaching us how to get there. So, too, are the wily campaigners of Southbridge rights, who in many ways equal the contributions of their tireless opponents, the likes of Eva Sachs and Ben Saul. But it is in the relationships and organizing of these rather normal folks, the way they answered the political question put before them, that we can understand not just how to win public goods, but how to maintain them. From them we can learn how to build an enduring commonwealth together for our own good. Those are the last lines of this beautiful book. Join me in thanking Jonathan Tarleton. Thank you, everybody.